Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. Can I ask everyone to make sure that mobile devices are switched off and put away, please? Agenda item 1 is budget scrutiny. Can I welcome our first panel this morning? We have Caroline Gilwood, Head of Programmes, Stonewall Scotland. Janice MacDonald, Chief Officer, Deaf Scotland. Liz McEntee, Director for External Affairs, Glasgow Council for the Voluntary Sector. Mary Snowdon, Coordinator, Human Rights Consortium Scotland. Adam Stahura, Head of Policy and Communications, Age Scotland. And Talat Yaqub, Director, Equate. Good morning, you're all very welcome. Before we start, I'd like to just thank members of the third sector and voluntary organisations who wrote to us. We welcome their views and acknowledge that the work they do across Scotland is essential. Given the scope of our inquiry and the limited time available to us, I'm going to ask witnesses to limit their remarks to our remit, and I'll just give everyone a reminder of that this morning. It is to explore public sector funding that delivers national equalities and human rights priorities and the accountability of public bodies partnering with the third sector in achieving better outcomes. If we stray off track, I'll intervene and bring us back into focus. We've got an hour for the first panel. So can I start with a reflection from our events in Glasgow and Camlin, which welcomed a national emphasis on human rights and equalities, but challenged the Scottish Government to, and this is a quote from them, do more than talk. There was, we spoke about the gap between aspirations and reality on the ground. So what more could the Scottish Government do to ensure that the third sector is supported in its efforts to protect, defend and promote access to human rights? Talat, can I come to you first?
No problem. In terms of supporting the third sector, there's no surprise that the first thing that's going to be discussed is funding and how the funding relationship works with the Scottish Government. So from my perspective, our organisation is working to provide support for women in science, technology, engineering, mathematics and the built environment, and often we're working with women who don't have access to support in other places. So what we do is important because they don't have employment support elsewhere. In terms of our funding structure, we've been on year funding since 2012, so it's been 1 year at a time. What that means is that we actually can't be as effective as we want to be in what we deliver because we are always under the pressure that it's about to finish and we don't actually have security as to what's happened next, which means our delivery is start and stop. And that has an impact on the people we're delivering for.
Sure, and I think that's something the committee will want to explore in a bit more depth. Who else would like to?
Follow up on that, I think the relationship that Age Scotland have with the Scottish Government is actually very good, particularly with different officials and ministers that where we're funded. The challenges can be with, as exactly said there, the different funding periods, whether it's 3 years or 1 year, and this, when they're 1 year funding, at what point do you kind of stop delivering and then start writing up the analysis of the project, or at what point are you are staff then looking for other options for employment, and you might actually find yourself losing very talented people because of this 1 year funding. I know a lot of organisations might look at how they will secure and safeguard this, but for many they'll have difficulty being able to finance that.
Okay, thank you. Liz.
I think I'll just come in here and say through the consultation that we've done and the event that we ran, very clear message really that came through around really kind of holding public bodies, local authorities, health and social care partnerships to account around their performance around equalities and human rights. At the moment, you know, we would question the robustness necessarily of equality impact assessments. I think there's something that came through very, very strongly at our meeting in particular around the need for a committee such as this or the government really to be kind of scrutinising, looking at the reporting arrangements that go back through the funding that goes to local authorities. So how much is that funding actually supporting those local authorities, those public bodies, to actually deliver on human rights and equalities?
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else wish to come in? Mary.
Yeah, I just want to say that, first of all, it is clear, I know you've heard this many times before, but the third sector are vital in terms of protecting human rights in Scotland. They are the ones that are often defending people's human rights, and without them, many basic human rights would not be realised. So it is vital that we value the third sector well. I want to highlight one particular thing. Whilst it is fantastic that there are so many good developments around human rights, that human rights are a priority of the Scottish Government without a doubt, and that a national task force on human rights leadership has been set up. We've also had Scotland's National Action Plan on Human Rights, which, as you know, is into its second phase. And what the evaluation found for the first phase was that it did a lot of very useful things, very valuable, and there was a huge amount of support for it, but it was underfunded. So there was not the resource for it to have the full effect that it could do. So we know for sure, actually, that if we're looking at a gap in terms of public sector funding and the impact that it could have on human rights, there has been a gap around SNAP, and it's important that this second phase of SNAP is properly supported and resourced by the Scottish Government.
Okay, thank you. Did anybody else wish to come in? Janice? You don't need to press it, it'll come on. So it comes on itself.
Oh, right. Sorry. I think there's one thing in addition that we would be looking at, which is around the expression of the socio-economic duty. There's quite a lot of delivery of equalities based on social benefit. And actually, I think quite a lot of the equalities organisations would be saying that we really need to have a better understanding of social economic benefit, because it's the economic benefit that makes the work more sustainable, and we're struggling to get that balance.
Okay, thank you. Caroline?
The key areas for Stonewall Scotland in relation to our funding is about evidencing impact and getting government to support us in terms of our outcomes and how we meet your outcomes, your equality outcomes, but also how we impact on our service users and the public in general.
Okay, thank you. One of the other things that was raised during our events was that equality groups could sometimes be pitted against each other. Just in terms of the way tendering and procurement and grant funding is operating, is this something that you would recognise, and what would the reasons be? Janice, you're nodding along.
Sorry, I'm still on, didn't mean that. Yeah, I think it's a big issue, and it makes it very difficult to get partnership approaches and actually to get some of the organisations to do what we would call bend the spend, so that they can be more inclusive of people that have communication barriers, for example. By working together, organisations could make themselves more accessible. So I do think it's a huge gap in the array of options that we could take forward.
And do you have any ideas on how we could improve that?
Well, I think it's very difficult to get access to actually looking at what the economic benefits would be. If I take communication as an example, then there would be huge opportunities for workforce upskilling and new jobs to be created to ease communication across the country. Some of them would be technical in terms of digital or acoustic wise, but it's very difficult. I've tried for 5 years to try and get some health economics work done to try and change our world the way that the Purple Pound report worked for people with mobility disabilities. So I think that there's the ways for us would be to join up some of the economic and social benefits. There's a tendency for equalities only to look at the social benefits.
Okay, thank you.
That makes sense.
Talat, were you wanting to come in here?
Yeah, I think largely the equalities sector, particularly in the third sector, are very good at partnership working. So we communicate well, we meet often to try and prevent duplication and the competitiveness, so we can work together and make it as effective as possible. I would say that works really well, particularly in our core funding that we have. Where I feel like the ball is dropped perhaps is the short-term smaller funding pots that exist, and they're sometimes mid-year. And those are new initiatives, and the emphasis tends to be on new as opposed to sustaining what is evidenced and evidence to work. And in that can create inefficiencies because you're pursuing something that will likely get you funded as opposed to something you're already doing and is evidence. And the short-termism of those projects means that we are sometimes pitted against each other, not in the core, but in the kind of secondary layer of funding that exists. And a second point to that, I appreciate wanting me to keep it short. A second point to that is one of the ways in which we can prevent being pitted against one another, or I don't think we are, I think there's a feeling of partnership, but to make the work effective is if third sector organisations, if equalities organisations are encouraged to take an intersectional approach, so that their work is going further and they're having to think about black minority ethnic women, disabled women, those at the sharpest end of policy making. I think that is of the most benefit of the work we do.
Thank you, that's helpful. Liz?
Yeah, I would want to just say, I know you asked the question specifically about equalities groups and organisations, but I would want to emphasise that it's an issue and a major issue for third sector organisations, not just who would necessarily self-identify as an equality organisation, but who would actually are delivering equalities outcomes, yes. And working with groups that are very vulnerable and who are therefore, at risk of, infringement of human rights, etc. So I would just want that point to be clear. And I think particularly when you're talking about, so organisations that are working in the field of social care, for example, where you have commissioning and procurement and tendering arrangements, that absolutely brings a huge emphasis on competition. And doesn't necessarily support collaboration. And we know from the work in Glasgow that we do, the organisations, sometimes they're questioning, is there a need really to tender, to have these arrangements in place when you have work that's being delivered that's working? Why do you have to keep repeating this? So, it's like, if something's working, why repeat, procure? Would be the question.
I think that's certainly something we've heard from lots of different organisations. Does anyone else want to? Yeah. Adam.
I just thought it was a very good point about the innovation. Now, while it's really important that any service that's publicly funded, reflects and adapts and actually looks to innovate when it is working really well, and there are people who rely on these services, the challenge is with new funding applications to go, how do we tweak this a bit to make it look cooler than it needs to be? And the danger then is that it might disappear entirely, and who else will pick up that? And I just think, for example, the Age Scotland Helpline is a good example of this, that on a very core service that we offer, I'm not sure how you innovate beyond tweaks in information, friendship and advice for the 20,000 people every year that we handle calls for.
Thank you. Fulton, bring you in.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. Kind of just moving on from that line of questioning, can I ask what each of your organisations, how much money is derived from the public sector, and to think about if that's in the form of grants or contract income, and also is it mainly from local authorities when we're talking about public sector, or Scottish Government?
First, from the public sector, as I recall, not down to the exact final pound, but I think from different sources in the Scottish Government, whether it's through the Equalities budget or through the housing budget, it's in the region of £300,000 or so every year through lots of different initiatives. The bulk of this is through Equality Department funding for helpline community development and some other aspects for communication with older people.
So what's that in a percentage of people's overall income?
Let's say, for instance, our helpline, probably the money that goes into that will probably around about 50 or 60% of that kind of service. Again, it's probably reflective of lots of things. We have a position from the housing department to kind of fund policy development work and get the insight of older people from across Scotland about housing and energy needs, and that's essentially wholly funded by the housing department.
Okay, somebody else?
So at Stonewall Scotland, about 30% of our funding comes from Scottish Government, and that funding adds value to our work, but we have a multiple range of funding streams.
Okay. Is there anybody else?
Well, I think at GCVS, again, it would be about a third of our funding would come from public authority, local authority and Scottish Government. We self-generate, we're a social enterprise. We rent out rooms in our buildings, we have a cafe, etc., and we run events. So there's a mixed funding package that we have. But we're an intermediate organisation, so essentially, I feel as I'm here to talk about other organisations that we actually engage with rather than our own organisation, and I would say that certainly with the organisations that we work with, the vast majority of organisations rely very heavily on public sector funding.
Okay, and Sorry, was there anybody else that wanted to come in on that?
I was just going to come and say that, so the consortium, it doesn't receive public sector funding, but the same as Liz, many of our members do and very much rely on it. And just to emphasise again that is a good thing from the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders says it's entirely appropriate and required that the state does provide support and funding for civil society organisations to play their critical role as being a critical friend and a challenge to government and to defend human rights. So that is a really positive thing.
And in terms of some of that public funding that you've talked about there for your organisations or the organisations that you represent, is there any human rights or equalities conditions that are placed on some of that funding, and what are they? So,
for us, for a chunk of money that will come from the Equalities kind of budget, there are lots of outcomes in terms of protecting the human rights and values for older people, their access to services, that again through the Age Scotland helpline to make sure old people have access to their rights. Outcomes are easily demonstratable. Community development work is entirely embedded that funding in terms of outcomes, with making sure that older people have the ability to interact with society and have lasting connections and lots of things therein. So they're kind of, they are really at the heart of the outcomes, or the human rights are at the heart of those outcomes.
Okay.
So at Stonewall Scotland, we receive that 30% of funding from the Promoting Equality and Cohesion Fund, and in order to receive that funding, we needed to evidence that we would help and support meet three of the four outcomes. And I can talk to you about what those are if that would be helpful.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah. I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, okay, so the three outcomes that we evidenced that we would support, help achieve, were the discrimination against people who share protected characteristics is reduced, and multiple discrimination is addressed so that the barriers to participation are reduced. That's one. Three is people and communities are supported to participate and engage in services and civic society, and their contribution is recognised and community cohesion is increased. And the third one is the current imbalance in representation in all aspects and levels of public life, including education and employment, and are addressed to better reflect our communities.
Okay, thanks very much. Does anybody else want to?
I think I would just want to echo what Mari said at the beginning, that it's inherent in the work of the third sector that they deliver on human rights and equalities. I mean, I think almost, every third sector organisation is making a significant contribution in that regard, but it's not necessarily stated as something that has to be reported on in terms of their funding requirement. Maybe that's something that could be considered, because actually if you looked at what the contribution was, I think it would be great to have that made more visible in some kind of way. But I would go back again to what I said to you at the outset about the importance, I think, of holding public bodies account through the funding that they get for what they actually deliver in that regard too.
Yeah, and I think that was the point of my question I was trying to get at, because for me personally, and I think anybody else, it was at the day, the event day that you had. There's no doubt the third sector involved organisations are doing so much good work, but I was just trying to tease out if there's conditions on some of the funding that's coming in. So that was really helpful, thanks.
Come in and
just to say that the entire premise of the organisation, the mission and vision and values of the organisation is based on equalities. For myself, it's about intersectional equalities for women, and the basis of the funding that we get, all funding that we get, is national from the Scottish Government, and it's through the Equalities Department. So the conditions on it are to reflect an equalities agenda and have outcomes that improve equalities and access to employment for women. So we are the basis of the funding is equalities outcomes.
Okay.
And Janice, yeah.
I think you make quite a good point. So, for example, our services that would be funded to do an equality job, in a sense, working with people affected by deafness. But the reality for us is that people in every protected characteristic would be affected by deafness. And we don't see the spend on communication support, for example, across even mainstream, where it should be happening. So we see simple things like aligning application forms for communication support to be budgeted in would be a simple thing that could be done that would make a big difference. I think for our lens on the world, we're cross-cutting as well as having a sort of line of our own, and it's trying to get people to establish the understanding of that if the communication's not right, it doesn't really enable the rest of the rights and people to enjoy their lives. I think is the point that we keep banging on about, and I do think that could be reflected in the structure of how the funds come through.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Mary Fay.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. I wanted to ask you a bit about the impact that the funding cycle has on your organisations, because in 2017 the government said they would move the equality funding cycle from 1 to 3 years. How has that impacted on each of your organisations? What difference has it or will it make? Who would like to start?
It makes a huge difference, and as Adam said there, one of the fundamental ways it will make a difference is being able to retain good staff. Despite being an equalities organisation, I don't think we're providing a fully equalities focused working experience, because I can only provide you with temporary contracts on a year-to-year basis. So there's something within that which is ironic given the work that we're meant to be delivering. So it will make a huge difference. I think it will help us on two levels. One, retain good staff, which makes us more efficient in the work that we do because we're not retraining and constantly rehiring. And secondly, it provides a consistency for, in our case, the women that we are delivering services for, because we don't have to stop in May to say, we'll let you know what happens and we'll back in touch in July. It provides consistency for our delivery.
Okay, that's helpful. Does anyone else want to comment, or are the views much the same across all of our witnesses? Janice?
I would say that the reality when it comes through is that it's still on a year-to-year basis. You might have we have a 3-year funding agreement, but it's reviewed every year. So you don't necessarily have the same feeling of surety, depending on the work that you're doing. And being an intermediary body, we feel a particular squeeze because we know that intermediaries aren't particularly popular at the moment, but we still feel we've got a job to do. So sometimes the principle doesn't actually maybe work through the system, if that makes sense.
I wonder if you could maybe explain in a bit more detail what that review process actually looks like. Is it almost a let's take stock of what's happened in the last year and look at your planning for the next 2, or is it more than that?
A bit of both, but it depends. Some of it is impacted even by churns in the department. If there's changes of staff and people are moved on, then we've experienced, for example, the 3-year shifting. So we had 3 years funding from April to March, and then over the most recent funding agreements have been from June onwards. So there was a 3-month gap that we had to sort of manage, and I think lots of projects were in the same view. So I think some of the review and follow through process needs to be more forward facing. So that we're not just still doing it in the March for the June, that we've got a bit more of a principled approach, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's very helpful. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Liz?
I just want to come in again. I'm not from an equalities organisation as such. I don't benefit from. I know you're asking specifically about equalities funding, but I do have to make the point that it's the funding arrangements for third sector organisations, voluntary organisations generally, if they're on a 1-year basis, don't work. And these are organisations, as I say again, that are working to deliver on equality and human rights issues, and they're working with people and communities that are really significantly affected by that. So it's just anything that can be done to increase the timing of funding for third sector organisations can only be a good thing. And for all the reasons that you were describing there, I would absolutely echo. I think in terms of longer term planning, ability to strategically plan, not lose staff, not lose resource. Look at also what's paid. It's not just the length of funding; it's the value of the funding that's given as well. So having that on a more equitable basis with arrangements for public sector organisations. I know we have third sector organisations that are funded, but the terms and conditions, as you'll have heard many times, I'm sure, are not on a par with what our public sector partners have, and yet we're picking up public sector services and work on a regular basis. So for all of those reasons, I would just want that to be broadened out, not to just be considered around equalities funding.
Thank you.
just for clarity, we absolutely recognise that in terms of delivering human rights, it goes right across the board. I suppose traditionally we scrutinise the Equalities budget, so that's why some of our questioning we worded like that. But it's helpful to hear that from you, and we do acknowledge that. Mary.
So it would be helpful for it to be 3 years, and here's the contract for 3 years. What has happened since 2017 is 3 years support as opposed to 3-year funding. So that's exactly the same situation we found ourselves in. So at the 1-year period, we have had to essentially put in a new funding bid that we would do on a year-to-year basis. So since 2017, I have not been in a position to give any employee a 3-year contract. It has still been a year-to-year because I don't have the security of a contract that says 3 years. It's 3 years in principle that we've had since 2017.
So, on the one hand, that's been a really good move, moving from 1 to 3 years, but in actual fact, it has made no real or tangible difference to your organisations.
No. The tangible difference would come from it being, here is a 3-year contract, and therefore
that would allow you to plan.
Yeah. It's been 3 years in principle, and we will review at the end of each year what you will receive the following year, which has been the same. However, it doesn't put me in a position where I can provide staff security, certainly.
Okay. Janice, did you want to come back in?
Well, I think the reality is it's 3 years in principle, but you're not guaranteed the 3-year funding. It can be withdrawn at any time in sort of contractual terms, but it can also be withdrawn on the annual reviews, and it can be quite difficult to know what the hoops you're going to have to jump through would be.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll put my next 2 questions into one, convener. I wanted now to ask you about the relationship between your organisations and local authorities, and how successful that relationship has been, and how the community planning partnerships work together, and whether or not you have any input in the decision-making process of the local authorities. Who would like to start? Liz?
Yeah, you're talking specifically about local authorities. I think our relationship with the local authority in Glasgow is improving. We've had a concordat put in place, which is an agreement between the local authority and the third sector in the city. That was launched a year ago. There are some very strong principles and a vision set for how we can work together. So I would have to say that that's a step in the right direction, but there's still a way to go in terms of translating words into action. I suppose we're talking culture change here that's really required over a period of time.
And do you have any input? Do your organisation has it any input into how the budget is spent across the areas that you represent?
So obviously we have third sector representatives on, say, community planning, partnerships, etc. I would say that most organisations who speak to us that fulfil that role feel that they're present there, but their level of influence they would question, and the sense of whether they make a real contribution to the decisions that are made would be questioned as well. I think sometimes there's a sense that decisions are taken outside the room or already made, etc. So I think there's a way to go on all of that, but certainly with the local authority bringing in this concordant, there's a willingness to review that, to review the relationship, to recognise the fact that, going forward, the third sector is a key partner and we have to work together in order to tackle the challenges that exist in Glasgow. So I think we're on a journey with this one. But there's a big culture shift that has to take place, and even from the days when, for example, GCVS was involved with working with reshaping care, and we were dealing with social work and health partners in the city, there's definitely a sense that where budgets are held by a body and responsible by a body, that the sharing of decision making, there's a tension there because you're not ultimately responsible for that budget. So you can be a partner, you can contribute, you can perhaps bring ideas to the table. Ultimately, because you're not responsible from a statutory point of view, then there's a lack of parity and a lack of equality, and that remains a challenge.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I was just going to say that there is we're looking at some funding models, particularly for, let's say, older people's groups and some smaller charities. There's been a move in some local authorities to into the IJBs, who will then distribute money and changes. And we've seen, for instance, looking at Edinburgh, there have been a whole load of older people's groups in areas of multiple deprivation who have had to fold as a result of, you know, the IJBs, how to kind of get in about who makes decisions there, and them deciding how this money is spent, let's say year 2 or year 3 after the initial kind of setup costs. There have been challenges in terms of at a local level in terms of where the funding pots come from, who they speak to, and you can even look at examples of, say, Care and Repair Edinburgh, who are a brilliant charity supporting old people and disabled people, where initially there'd be some funding coming from Edinburgh City Council, then it moves to the IJB, and having to re-establish relationships and for the IJB to work out its value in terms of delivering support for older and disabled people in their own homes and kind of keeping them out of, say, hospital or other social care settings. So there's been a challenge, I think, there initially.
Okay, that's helpful. Does anyone else want to comment? Liz, did you want to come back in?
I just want to come back in because you specifically asked about local authorities, but I can say something about health and social care partnerships as well as part of this, because I think that that particular body presents significant challenges for third sector organisations because it is so complex, it's so bureaucratic, it's so multifaceted. There are so many different committees that exist, you know, and I don't think this is not solely in Glasgow. I mean, this is across the piece. Having one non-voting third sector representative on the integrated joint board is not very helpful, you know, so you're asking about, you know, influence and so on. If you don't have a voting right, then, you know, if third sector doesn't have voting rights, then that clearly limits our ability to actually influence decision making. And I think the whole issue about organisations, you know, being involved in committees and being there to represent, when it's not really resourced and third sector organisations are having to give up time and that's not on a resource basis, then that represents a real challenge as well. So I think you've heard in other committees about there being what's termed a democratic deficit. I would agree with that. GCS would agree with that.
Thank you. Thank you.
You wanting to come in? Yeah.
I would kind of bore myself on this point, actually. I think the reality is that people affected by deafness are not generally in the rooms and round the tables, and that communication support and that accessibility is not there sort of across the board. Now, that's not to say there aren't examples of really good practice, and there are forums and things that have taken additional steps, but we see that as a big gap. There's almost like two populations in Scotland, the hearing population and those who have challenges. And I think we feel quite strongly that inequalities will always survive unless we can narrow those gaps. So I think that's a big budgetary issue in terms of the Scottish budget and how those principles cascade through.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Alec.
Thank you very much, Camina. Good morning to the panel. I'd like to start by directing a question specifically to Age Scotland, but it actually has a bearing on all of your organisations, so please do feel free to come in. I was keen that Age Scotland come today because I feel that one protected characteristic we've not really addressed as a committee previously is age. And so in the context of budget scrutiny, which we're doing today, can you, Adam, and then other people on the panel, feel free to join in, give us an idea of the sort of structural problems in budgeting when it comes to older people, decisions that are taken without older people in mind, which perhaps restrict the universe in which they live or exclude them from our society?
That's a very good question. Obviously, age is a protected characteristic, but also, let's say, older age, there is so much cross-section across every other protected characteristic and every other necessary equalities angle. It is one of these things I've found in, say, the last 18 months at Age Scotland that it can often be overlooked, the kind of needs of older people in general. And I want to think about people's access to their rights and human rights. We've got a society just now which is moving like a lightning pace towards digital by default. But I've said as a committee in the Scottish Parliament in the past that there are 500,000 people in Scotland over the age of 60 who do not use the internet. That's the population of this city. And having access to information and advice is hugely important, knowing where they can go, whether it's at the end of a phone or the 170,000 pensioners in Scotland who live in poverty, who then couldn't even afford to have access to digital services. So when you're looking across actually Janice and I sat and delivered a similar presentation with the NHS last year on digital developments. When you're delivering services, designing services in general, looking for the kind of easy thing for people, whether or the most cost effective, it's digital, but it misses a huge number. of people and making sure that those who are most in need don't get left behind. It's the same thing we feel and say repeatedly on, say, bank branch closures or the lack of ATMs or huge numbers of things, the closure of community centres. There's lots of things, for instance, local authorities will do and kind of centralise services, but actually will exclude huge numbers of people, and then those people also have lots of different equality elements to them too. So I think for older people in general, and look, for Age Scotland, we say it's everyone over the age of 50. So there's huge needs changes, whether it's, and the reason I can see the convener sort of raised eyebrows there, and it's entirely because at the age of 50 we know that age discrimination kicks in the workplace. So we find that, the age of 55, the workers who still have 10, 15, maybe even 20 years left in them of brilliant kind of experience and service are being denied opportunities to develop, to look at kind of flexible working, to look at their caring responsibilities, whether the sandwich generation. So actually, when age is such an important issue in terms of how people access their rights, and there's huge numbers of barriers that exist, and as we move, as I said, to digital, by default, the number of people being left behind will be those most needing access to services that have gone online.
Forgive my raised eyebrow there. I was just realising that I wasn't that far off older age, if that's where you're...
I don't believe it 1 second. No, not at all.
Before I bring in other colleagues on this issue, can I just ask you further, Adam, about we're not just looking at national budgeting here, we're also looking at local budgeting as well, and where the sort of structural problems are in terms of consideration of older people's needs at a local authority level?
One of the things that we're starting to campaign on, and we know there's some other older people's charities the same, is the idea of a local authority having an older person's champion. We have these things with, say, veterans champions and lots of other champions, local authorities, someone who can put up their hand and raise these needs. And I do wonder whether at local authority level there is anybody really considering broadly what this means for older people. And touch wood, we're all going to get old and we might need access to services, or let's say it was decisions made about kind of roadworks. Let's look at the most kind of micro level here, things that might seem inconsequential to many people, but for a lot of older people, let's say the decision to dig up X number of roads will have a significant impact on lots of older people with mobility issues, those people living with dementia, whose routine and structure is required, or the access to proper signage, or changing the routes to different places, and bus stops, and proper, lots of different things, where actually one of the elements which should really be thought of is how will this affect person X, Y, or Z, or will they have dementia, are they old, have they mobility problems? And I'm not entirely convinced that it's an afterthought, is really where we're going. And usually as a result of people like Age Scotland and lots of other organisations kicking up a stink about it after something's happened, and then trying to unpick it and roll it back.
Excellent. And by way of bringing in everybody else, obviously being old is not something we do in isolation. There is intersectionality. People who are lesbian, gay and transgender and bisexual become old. People who are deaf become old, or become deaf when they are old. So by way of bringing in everybody else in, can you have a reflection on how the protected characteristics your organisations work with and represent deal with that, and your views on getting older?
I can come in on the older person's issue itself, because we run a service, Community Connectors, in Glasgow, which supports older people who are socially isolated in the city, and connects them to the services that will help address that. But from working with that particular project, and also with the charities, that we consulted with through the event that we held, etc., they're just consistently telling us that actually kind of where people are entitled to support, or they have rights, these are being denied by public agencies, and no one is under any impression that it's not really challenging with in terms of the public sector fiscal environment, but nonetheless around social care, where you're talking about, there are fantastic, you have as a government, and a parliament, fantastic legislative frameworks, etc., and vision for how you want Scotland to be, but the reality doesn't match the rhetoric that is expressed at national level, and so you have charging policies where you've got free personal care policy, you have long waiting lists for services, you have things like podiatry services for older people that are being restricted, and that means that people can't get out, they can't walk, or they're at risk of falling, that kind of thing. You have delays in adaptations being put into people's homes. All of these kind of small things, relatively small issues, but make a huge difference to the quality of people's lives and their ability to live and to engage. And so those issues are really kind of prominent in terms of the conversations that we have with organisations that are working with older people. What I would say, though, is that in Glasgow, again, with our health and social care partnerships, there's a real look at maximising this whole agenda of maximising independence, and we are being brought into the fold at an early stage to have those conversations, and we really welcome that, because we're actually starting to look at, okay, what can the third sector do to improve things around health and social care provision. So yes, there are challenges, but I think the direction of travel is also looking more positive, I have to say, than it has in recent years.
The LGBT community, age is something that we need to address and we need to look at, particularly supporting other third sector organisations and other public sector bodies, understanding what the needs of elderly LGBT people are. So, for example, our research shows us social isolation, for example, the fact that health and social care may not have the right support in place or understand the specific needs of LGBT people, particularly going into care homes, for example, and accessing healthcare, but also the attitudes of other older people and the cultural shifts. And historically, LGBT inclusion hasn't been necessarily as good as it is today, and helping them understand what the needs of their peers might be. So we see ourselves as more of a consultancy and advisory sort of function, really, in helping public bodies and other third sectors understand the needs of LGBT people in later years.
Can I just interrogate that slightly deeper, Caroline? Because I met an LGBT wing of a business yesterday, and they talked about a really horrific story of an elderly lesbian couple, one of whom had dementia and had actually kind of gone back into the closet, as it were. They'd forgotten that they had come out and embraced their sexuality, and their wife was really struggling with this because obviously she wanted to provide a loving relationship to that person. But also, I think that you mentioned care homes as well, and this idea, and I read a report recently going back into the closet about this sort of the fact that we have got very good at allowing people to live their authentic lives, the real person that they are in normal mainstream society, whatever you want to call it. But as soon as we start to sort of retire and move back into places like care homes, that can regress a bit. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
I think it's about education, and I think it's about empowerment. So I think it's twofold. It's supporting health and social care staff to understand the needs. And I think you give a great example, actually, of dementia and Alzheimer's, for example, and how somebody can shift and their identity can regress, as you say. But it's also about support for the care home residents as well. So having... it's difficult for people who were brought up in an environment during Section 2028, Section 2A, for example, where LGBT identities were not talked about and accepted within society. So it's about supporting staff to be able to challenge that behaviour gently and kindly and understanding the context in which they're operating in. And that's something that Stonewall and other LGBT charities are looking at quite closely, and looking at programmes and packages of support that can help.
Janice.
We think the rights-based, person-centred approach is the best way to do that, because it very much focuses on what's right for individuals. And I think the issues for us would be twofold in terms of budget. With the ageing population, there's an increasing level of hearing loss, of deafness in the community. Currently, we're saying at age 60% of people have some sort of hearing loss. That would shift the mainstream thinking quite a lot if that message was loud and clear. We're concerned about an increased level of loss as the digital work comes through, because quite a lot of people are sticking things in their ears all the time. Either the vibrations or the noise or both will cause an increase in the level of hearing loss in time. So I think for us, we would like to see a bit more preventable deafness being addressed, but also planning for older age and understanding the communication barriers. Because again, we would say all these things can only happen when people can communicate around them. And I'll be one of those older people in the workforce, or I am one of the two.
It's worth reflecting that many of the comments have made, such as Adam saying that it's a bit of an afterthought, so older people are a bit of an afterthought, and in some ways it gets to the heart of how budgets are made. And I know you've heard plenty about this, but it is about a human rights-based budget from the outset. So I don't know what the committee can do in terms of questioning that, both at national government level, but also in local authorities. It's actually about the process of how the budget is made right from the start, where you start from what people's rights are, and you look at how you're going to progressively realise them and put steps in place, and then you would avoid the afterthought situation.
I think that's something we're acutely aware of, and you're in it right now. That's what we're trying to do. I'm going to move on and bring Oliver Mundell in with his questions.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to pick up on two questions that kind of come up all the time, but came up when we were in Glasgow. And the first one was just whether there's a conflict between for advocacy organisations, between their role in defending the rights of vulnerable people and a feeling that they shouldn't criticise the bodies who are providing them with funding. Is that something either you've come across yourself or that members of your organisations or consortiums have experienced?
Happy to kick off on this one. I think the kind of definition of lots of organisations might take, say, money from Scottish Government to be a critical friend. I am pretty sure that there are people in the Health Department who do not like our, at Age Scotland's, regular criticism of the sky-high levels of delayed discharge, for example, or lots of things. It doesn't stop us in any shape or form standing up for the interests of older people. We're not just sort of sitting in a silo, and it is to help channel the voices and the views and the needs of older people. Sometimes there'll be diplomacy required in how you go about things. You know, let's look at an example of a report we wrote in May on the length of time that older people were waiting to actually receive the social care that it was deemed necessary for them. You know, 43% weren't getting the 6-week period. You know, I think on paper you'd say that Scottish Government would not be very happy about this kind of thing going out. It was actually directed more at health and social care partnerships, but that wouldn't stop us in any stretch of imagination making things really, really clear, so that they can see where there have been difficulties. And I am aware of, and some journalists have mentioned in the past, there have been organisations, different ones, who have been reluctant to criticise, say, the government or local authorities or whoever else on a decision because they knew either funding was coming up or that their core funding was entirely dependent upon them. And I don't think that was necessarily something to give the Scottish Government that you shouldn't do this, but I think they were maybe aware that that could cause them difficulties, but not necessarily for us.
It's an issue that came up quite a lot when we were putting together a report at the end of last year around strategic litigation and whether charities, NGOs get involved in taking cases to court. And one of the messages we heard back often was that there is a concern, and I can't stress enough, it's not necessarily that it's in terms and conditions. I don't actually think that is the case. I think it's because of the relationships between organisations and those that they fund, and obviously there's a feeling that therefore it would be difficult to take cases against them, which anyone can understand. And as I said earlier on, actually it's entirely appropriate and correct that the public sector, that the government, both local and national, do fund civil society. So that's not an issue. But I think what it did kind of highlight to us is that there is a continual need for government to repeat often and clearly that it is an absolutely appropriate role of civil society to be critical actually of government, and they're not playing their role unless they challenge things and push it on, including by taking cases to court if that's appropriate, because that means that actually human rights law is enforced in practice. It doesn't just stay in the law books, but that actually has an impact. So I think it's something to be very alive and aware of, and I think we need to I think government need to continually look for ways to say this is absolutely appropriate that you take those steps and be challenging, because that's your quite proper role.
Can I just ask, I wonder, I can sort of understand that for larger organisations that are well known, like Stonewall and Age Scotland, that there's almost a bit of a comfort and a protection in your size, and people know you and respect you. I wonder if this is more about sort of smaller community-based organisations that are perhaps being funded by health and social care or local authorities.
Is that working?
Yes.
I do think that there's an element of that. I mean, you're right, it came out very strongly at the Glasgow event. We hear about it anecdotally on a regular basis. I think, yes, you're right, smaller organisations do feel vulnerable. They look to us as a third sector interface to take on that role, because they feel that we, in that regard, in terms of representing their interests and you know, giving voice to their interests, will protect them. So we hear things anecdotally, but it's very much stressed that do not name us, don't share who said this. And obviously the event that we had was about protecting identities as part of that. But it is a concern, because I think it goes to the heart of you know, the independence. I completely agree with what you've just said, Mary. I think we've got to really make sure that we retain the independence of the sector, and just because you're funded by a particular body, that isn't diluted somehow. And I think that, you know, the role of critical friend that I think you, Adam, were talking about is really crucial in all of this. There's a duality in the nature of the relationship between funders and public bodies and the sector, and I think that we really have to, you know, argue strongly that needs to be retained. But it is happening, and we know that organisations do feel that decisions around funding, etc., are impacted if they speak out.
Certainly from Equate Scotland's point of view, I have no problem openly criticising things that aren't working for women, and I think that's pretty evident in all the work that we've been doing. But what I would say is, just following on from what Mary said and Liz as well, having that perception removed does lie with the funder as well. Being able to say openly that we expect criticism and that you're not bound by this funding because it is right and proper and duty to provide the funding. And we have a relationship that is very much of a critical friend. When something isn't working, we're very open about that, and whether that's publicly or within a meeting, we feel at ease being able to do that. But that might also be something that is specific because we're a national organisation, not working hand in hand with a local authority on a ground level. So making that vocal, I think, is hugely helpful.
Okay, Janice, were you?
I think there's several layers to your question, actually. And on a human level, it can be more difficult to be critical, just in terms of that conversation and working out how you're going to be critical and friendly at the same time, because quite often the criticism is adversarial. People are protecting money. I think the other layer is often about confidence. Many of the smaller organisations or organisations dealing with people who are maybe harder to reach, further, easier to ignore, are often less confident. They're not so well established, and there's a confidence and a skills issue in some of that, and we suffer from maybe the lack of skills building in the sector sometimes as well, which I think is another area that funders need to consider. So I do think your question's quite multi-layered, but I do think there's a lot of organisations who would not feel confident to be that critical.
Thank you very much. The second question, again, I think probably does apply more to smaller organisations. But it was just, again, whether there's a sort of danger of mission creep where, because of funding pressures or the influence of kind of public sector bodies, organisations are kind of pressured into or forced to take on kind of new work or new areas that weren't their kind of original mission or kind of core purpose. So again, it was something that came up from a few of the organisations in Glasgow.
Again, I would just kind of probably reiterate what was said at the Glasgow session. Yes, I mean, it can happen, it does happen. I don't think it's just smaller organisations. I think that, you know, third sector organisations in general, if they're dealing with the need to survive, frankly, and where funders perhaps don't always fund core costs, etc., there is a pressure to have multiple funding resources, and therefore it can take organisations in different directions. And I think there's a well-known kind of model or a diagram that shows third sector organisations as tentacled octopus organisations, almost, because they've followed so many different routes for funding. But I think that at the same time, you know, certainly as a third sector interface, you know, it was providing support to third sector organisations, over 3,000 organisations in Glasgow. We do our best to make sure that they're well governed, that they realise that, you know, the dangers potentially of mission creep, because you've got to clearly keep within the bounds of your mem and arts, etc. So I think it's something that can happen, but it's because of the pressures to survive and to access funds in order to generate that survival.
Do you think that particularly impacts on equalities and human rights more than other areas, or do you think it's
I couldn't comment on that, to be honest with you. I think for what we see is kind of an across the board issue. Yeah.
I do think there is a particular funding pressure, though, I think which we absolutely need to recognise. I think there's a bit of a perfect storm of issues at the moment for the third sector, in that they've been hit by public sector cuts at the same time as austerity and other measures have increased needs. And then I hate to mention the word, but due to Brexit, actually that need's only going to increase, and yet we know that unless EU funding to this sector, which is critical, is replaced properly and replaced with equality at its heart and not just GDP, then we're in a much more concerning place in terms of the gap that there will be for funding for the sector. So I think it would be useful in terms of looking at the budgets for the committee to look at actually what are the Scottish Government doing to consider the impact of there being no EU funding actually for the sector, and particularly what can they do to try and make sure that any replacement has got equality at its heart. Because one of the things actually about EU funding, that although we were all very critical of the amount of bureaucracy that it had, it did actually have equality and social inclusion throughout it. So it did actually have an impact on meeting people's basic human rights and getting those in place. That about half of the funding had equality indicators, and so what we don't want is a very narrow economic funding replacement. So what the Scottish Government can do to consider what the gaps are, but also in terms of the Scottish Government's Brexit funding, how much... Sorry.
Remember I said I would intervene if we strayed a little wide.
Yeah,
I think it's difficult to separate the topics.
Yeah, it's very critical actually, because in what part of the Brexit funding from the Scottish Government is directed to the third sector? That's what I was going to say. I think that's a very important question to ask.
Oliver, are you...
Yeah, no, I'm happy that it's done, but I will follow up on that point. I think it is important, so thank you.
Okay, I just finally wanted to pick up on something that Talat had mentioned and we'd heard in our events as well, in terms of fair work for employees in charity and third sector. We obviously heard about short-term contracts there. So I suppose and I think I'm probably asking this already knowing the answer, but just to get it on the record, what needs to happen to make sure we can have fairer working conditions for people who are working, delivering the equalities and human rights of others? So in terms of secure contracts, living wage, that type of thing. I'll come to you first.
So I think it's, excuse me, I think there's two things. It's about the level of funding that is received, and it's also about the longevity of the funding. So, for example, we have had, our core funding has been static for a number of years, whilst costs have increased. So things that have, obviously, salaries are not impacted by that, because that would be wholly inappropriate, but staff development opportunities, growth opportunities are stifled by that, because that's an extra that we can't provide, but we should as an equalities organisation. An equalities organisation that is about the workplace, we should be doing that. And secondly, and it will always come down to this, is moving away from fixed term contracts that are year on year, which mean that I can't provide security to staff, and means that I lose, and I have done, excellent staff as a consequence.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, echo everything that you're saying there, but what I would also say is that I know what you're saying about salaries, that would be inappropriate, but we know from a lot of organisations that we work with that actually, you know, they don't pay increments, they don't pay salary increases, there are standstill budgets, you know, in terms of funding. That's a real term cut, frankly, as that goes on. So I think just recognising the importance, it's an old term, but I think we need to bring it back into, you know, usage, the full cost recovery issue in terms of the way that organisations are funded, to make sure that actually, you know, that the potential for organisations to keep par with pay increases, pensions, all the rest of it, not paying, you know, 0 hours contracts, etc. It's particularly an issue, as you know, around care and social care, childcare, social care.
I think the other point that was made to us was that volunteers aren't free and they have to be invested in and trained and looked after properly. Yeah. Okay, well, that brings us our first panel to a close. Thank you very much for your evidence. That's been very helpful. We'll suspend for around 5 minutes now. Welcome back, everybody, and can I welcome our second panel. We have Tim Kendrick, Community Manager, Fife Community Planning Partnership, Bernadette Monaghan, Director of Community Empowerment and Equalities, Glasgow City Council, Linda Owen, Strategic Planning and Commissioning Manager, Dumfries and Galloway Health and Social Care Partnership, and Professor Alison McCallum, Director of Public Health Policy at NHS Lothian. You're all very welcome this morning. Can I just give a reminder, said some words on for our first panel about the scope of our inquiry, so just a refresher on what it is we're looking for, to explore public sector funding that delivers national equalities in human rights priorities and the accountability of public bodies partnering with the third sector in achieving better outcomes. And the committee will do their very best to have focused questions, and if we wander off, I'll bring us back to topic. Can I start by asking the degree to which the third sector contributes to decision making in health and social care partnerships, and your reflections as to whether they're equal partners, please?
I can start with that one.
Yes, Linda.
I suppose it's difficult because I suppose from our partnership point of view, the third and independent sector are in our partnership, and we see them very much as equal partners. However, I think if you had a third sector organisation here, they may have a different view, because we are linked very closely with our third sector interface. However, similar to the lady from Glasgow earlier, they represent 3,000 different organisations across Dumfries and Galloway, so it's very difficult. And it's always been a challenge about how you get representation from the third sector, but certainly about a quarter of our budget goes out to the third and independent sector, so we see them very much as equal partners. They have full seats on the IGB, they're involved in decision making, they get involved in workshops, prior policy, strategy, planning. They're involved all the way through that. So certainly from our point of view, we think they are equal partners.
Okay, does anyone else wish to come in? Tim?
I'm not really qualified to answer that question in relation specifically to health and social care. My remit's more around the broader involvement in the community planning partnership, and the health and social care partnership is one of the partners. So I'll leave that to colleagues to answer that one.
I would probably just echo what Tim has said. The Health and Social Care Partnership is one of the partners in our community planning partnership, as is the Glasgow Equalities Forum and Glasgow Third Sector Interface Network. We've been doing a review of governance around community planning structures, and we now have the equalities groups more formally represented and reporting into that structure. So I think there are opportunities to influence decision making in a broader sense. We've also got the Third Sector Concordat that we signed off with the Third Sector Interface on behalf of the whole of the third sector, and an action plan that sits behind that we work through with our partners, and we report back to the wider sector. So I think there's always room for improvement, but I think we're going in the right direction of trying to be much more inclusive of our third sector, and I'm sure we'll come on to funding. They worked alongside us in constructing the new fund, and in holding stakeholder engagement events with the wider third sector as well.
Okay. Alison,
so from a board perspective, we would see the third sector as equal partners at the team level. So for particular population groups, for example, we work very closely with the third sector as part of the team around the child, the team around the adult, the multidisciplinary team. The third sector deliver essential services.
Can I ask you to explain a bit more about what you mean by team level? Do you mean
in practice? So at the coalface, whatever you want to call it, as part of a group of professionals working with individual patients and particular population groups. So that's one area in which they work closely with us. So we see them as equal partners at that team level.
So I suppose my question specifically about the decision-making level, which would... Yeah.
Yes, so in terms of their input around decisions for individuals, which is one of the things that's come up in evidence, and then at decision-making, clearly there are, we have the same relationships at Integration Joint Board and at community planning level with the third sector interface organisations and with the third sector representatives. What happens from my experience on an Integration Joint Board is that the third sector representatives work very, very hard with the broader sector to get views on policy, strategy and decision making in order that that voice is fed in as an equal partner.
So I suppose my challenge to you all would be, why would third sector partners feel like it isn't an equal partnership? Why would that come up, do you think? Can you think of reasons why that might be a perception?
To the volume and the number that I suppose if we take a straw poll of this room, everybody here will have a slightly different opinion on a particular matter. Multiply that up by 3,000 and you get a different scenario. I think there are certainly a bit similar to Alison. Our third sector interface does have forums and engage with as many third sector organisations as they possibly can to inform their views when they are around those tables. But I do think it's a challenge because they don't have funding forever in the same way as we have statutory funding. We are funding them on a 3 to 5 year cycle, sometimes year to year, depending on what our budgets are allowing. So I think sometimes some of that maybe makes them feel like they're not an equal partner, even though from a policy and strategy and decision making point of view they are an equal partner. But I think it's how it's reflected, but that's just my views on it.
So I suppose that somebody looking at from the outside at a health and social care partnership would say, right, how are decisions made? So if there's disagreement round the table amongst the equal partners, who gets to decide what way the decision goes?
Well, the legislation has put in place that it's the voting members of the Integration Joint Board are councillors and NHS board members. So by virtue of the legislation, we're actually, you know, I think in our IGB we've maybe voted a handful of times. Most of the times we have managed to reach consensus, but the legislation prevents their non-voting members.
Okay, thank you. Oliver, you had a supplementary.
Yeah, no, it was on exactly that point, convener, just when Linda Owen had said full members of the IGB. I just was going to clarify because I think from our first session there's certainly a strong feeling amongst the third sector on that, but I'll just leave that and come back to it.
Can I ask you what the key public policy areas are where you think that individuals and protected groups are particularly struggling to realise their rights?
If I could kick off, I would say it's particularly around the anti-poverty agenda, welfare reform agenda at the moment. One of the things that we've done in Fife, since following on from the Fairer Fife Commission that produced the Fairness Matters report about 4 years ago, has been to work with the third sector and the Equalities groups in particular to try and ensure that they have more of a strategic voice. That was one of the points that came out of the Fairer Fife Commission. So at a strategic level, we've reviewed our community planning partnership. We now have a specific sectoral group looking at welfare reform and anti-poverty, which is chaired by the council but has a broad representation. So I think it's something that we're tackling at a strategic level, but in all fairness, it's at the individual level that we would agree that it's not always easy for individuals and groups to influence the life circumstances that they're in. Okay. And I think there's a real issue around funding there. I think having referred to the submission from Fife Centre for Equalities, although they deliver on a range of outcomes against the outcomes in our local outcome improvement plan, they recognise that their funding doesn't stretch to the individual casework and support work that's needed to support individuals that are struggling to find their way around the welfare system. So I would say that that's a particularly critical area at the moment.
Okay. Does anyone else wish to come in?
Yeah, I think for us, just thinking of one area around community budgeting. We have taken an approach in Glasgow through the 4 pilot areas that we did, that we wanted that process to be as inclusive as possible. So, for instance, we worked with Glasgow Disability Alliance, who supported disabled people to engage in that process, and we worked with a group called YOMO to support young people's participation. So it's really thinking about these key drivers through the Community Empowerment Act, about how we actually make sure that the approach taken is inclusive and it is an authentic partnership, and we are supporting groups with protected characteristics to actually participate in those processes and in that decision making. I would say for us that strategically we have good structures in place through the Glasgow Quality Working Group. We have a BME strategy group. We work very closely with our colleagues in the disability networks, but I think there's in terms of funding, the main source of funding would have been through our grant giving fund that actually will finish at the end of March next year and is being replaced by New Glasgow Communities Fund. And when we talk about communities, it's very much in the spirit of place-based communities of interest, communities of identity. And the feedback we've had from our qualities groups is very much that the fund, that as it stands at the moment and has been for decades, and it's been a major fabric of the city. So this move to a new open progressive fund is a big culture change, but it's been closed to many groups with protected characteristics for a long time. So for the first time they will have the opportunity to put forward proposals and hopefully, you know, to have funding considered by the council. So I think that's a step forward. Strategically, I think there is good representation through the community planning structures and also through our Wellbeing Empowerment Community and Citizen Engagement Committee. But I think there is probably more work to do around how we support organisations. I think also there better connectivity between citywide work of equalities groups and work that's carried out in local communities. I think, again, through the new fund, there's an opportunity for us to collect better data because we know there are a lot of people with protected characteristics living in poverty, experiencing inequality and disadvantage, and to have that information and really, I think, to ensure that people have greater access to voluntary sector support and services that they actually need. So I think that's the direction of travel, and we're working very much alongside the Glasgow Quality Forum, the Glasgow Quality Working Group to shape what we need to do to make sure that equalities groups are supported and represented through those processes.
Okay, thank you. I'll bring in Fulton McGregor.
Good morning, panel. I just wanted to ask a question about to what extent you think that language is a barrier to people accessing their rights, both in terms of BSL and foreign language users, and what are local authorities and other public bodies doing to help people overcome these in your experience?
Happy to kick that off. I think language is a huge issue, and in particular, quite apart from the funding that we provide for translation and interpreting services, I think it's the support in terms of joining some of that work up to ensure that wherever possible, clients aren't having to knock on the door of 4 different agencies and ask for 4 different sets of services, and that is a challenge. I think another area is that in the whole area of English as a second language, and certainly in terms of our ESOL work, we've very much been focusing on working with Syrian refugees across Fife. And again, the challenge there is to link in work around language with work around integrating those communities into the rest of the Fife community. So rather than providing ESOL in a classroom setting, we're taking it out to voluntary organisations like Clear in Buckhaven, where they work weekly with migrants and refugees in a community setting, in a community garden, so that they're actually establishing links with the local community while learning their language skills. But I would say that the issue of language is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is lack of awareness of what services are out there. So particularly within some of the specific BME communities, such as the older Chinese community, And some of the smaller communities in a urban rural setting like Fife can feel quite isolated, quite apart from their the lack of language skills.
I think to add to that, I suppose we're in the process of starting to undertake a new learning disability strategy, and that will be coming out in Easy Read, because that's something that, when we're speaking about language, actually for that particular client group, quite often people want it in Easy Read, and it actually makes more sense. I think the other thing is that I think sometimes it's difficult, because for some things like carers' rights, for example, in certain languages and culture, the word carer doesn't translate into, I think it's Punjab and Urdu, I think, or it's definitely Punjab. There isn't a word in the Punjab language for the word carer. Therefore, even if we're translating, carer services and, information about carers' rights, there's not that recognition of the word if you don't have English as a second language. So there's some work that needs to be done even beyond language that goes into that wider culture of things as well. So sometimes you're right, the language can be a barrier.
Building on that, we have interpretation and translation services in-house in NHS Lothian now. They are still not used every time they could be. There are still bureaucratic problems that we're working with communities to resolve to make them more accessible. But we also have the Minority Health Inclusion Service, which helps with some of that untranslatable ideas. And some of those ideas are not just untranslatable in languages from more distant countries. Other European countries have the same issues. We work very closely with our established communities, and particularly with our Polish and Eastern European more recent migrants, to understand why they want to use services in a particular way and how we can make them more, I guess, culturally competent. We also work very closely with Deaf Action and with our local group, and my Equality and Human Rights leads tells me that recently we reached 1,300 of 1,800 potential folk. We got them to work with us on developing our Equality and Human Rights plan, making sure that we had that in BSL, and that we webcast that. So we have a number of people who come to meetings with us to discuss how we're doing and tell us quite clearly what we need to do better, but also ensure that we have a wider reach for those who are unable to attend. And I would say that I think the Assistive and Augmentative Communication Act has been really, really helpful in getting this up the agenda. Our speech and language colleagues work really hard with us to make sure that we implement good practice across the system. And again, when we produce material, we work with groups like FAIR and with our Learning Disability Connect groups to deliver things like videos for bowel screening and leaflets and papers. My personal view is that our default should be things that are accessible to people who need simple language, because when everyone is ill, they need things expressed clearly and simply and not technically, even if when they were well, they were a linguist. So it should be our default setting, and we should be structuring our communications to do that.
You want to come in here?
Well, points briefly. We fund ESOL provision through the third sector, but we're working very closely with our colleagues in community learning and development in particular to ensure that there's much greater alignment between what they're doing and community planning, particularly at local level. Also, Glasgow's first BSL reference group met for the first time on October 1st, and that group will actually provide a link to council services and community planning. I suppose also when you asked the question, what I was thinking of more generally is the language around the Community Empowerment and the Community Empowerment Act, and that's basically sitting there above everything that we do, and certainly in community empowerment services, but also across community planning. So it's much more, its influence, I think, much more how community planning partners work together to do things for the benefit of the city. It's influencing how we work in council departments, for instance, you know, with Glasgow Life, with property and land, with neighbourhoods and sustainability, how we talk to each other, because community engagement is at the heart of everything that we actually do. We're looking at what we do in terms of mainstreaming, participatory budgeting, what the next phase will look like. And again, it's sort of community engagement is there. So we're beginning to see a different approach where it's permeating the language of the Community Empowerment Act and the fact that communities have rights to own land and buildings, to tell us how money should be spent, to really participate in a meaningful way, I think is having an influence on the direction of travel, certainly for Glasgow's Community Planning Partnership and the next iteration of our Community Action Plan as well. So for me, that's quite a powerful framework that sits there and shapes how we do business as a public body, but also how we work with our third sector partners and how we try and create a much more equal relationship and authentic participation and partnership with partners too.
Thank you. Okay, Annie, you probably want to
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, panel. I was going to touch on what specifically was happening in Glasgow with regards to better relationships and better partnerships, but I think you've covered that in your earlier responses and just the one there. But what I would like to ask the panel is, how do community planning partnerships ensure that local outcome improvement plans are consistent with the national equalities and rights priorities, and how is this evaluated and monitored?
I'm happy to kick off there. Going back to a previous reply that I made, the current iteration of our local outcome improvement plan essentially evolved from the Fairness Matters report. So rather than having an anti-poverty and financial inclusion plan and fairness plan sitting alongside the overall council and community plan, it's now it's a single plan with fairness at its heart. So what we've done is we've adopted the key recommendations from the Fairer Fife Action Plan and included that now in our annual reporting on the outcomes in the Local Outcome Improvement Plan. So I think the important point there is that the fairness agenda and the inclusion agenda permeates all four of the overall outcome themes within the plan for Fife. And we have a planning and performance framework that means that not only are we monitoring the delivery of activities and outputs, but we're developing an overall State of Fife report that we'll be publishing early next year. They'll essentially be looking at the high-level outcomes in terms of fairness and in terms of some of the other key outcomes across the plan. So I think the key point there is not to look at fairness and equalities outcomes to one side as an add-on, but to integrate those into the whole monitoring and evaluation framework for the work that we're doing.
The converse of that, which is at the start of the process, to ensure that integrated impact assessment is undertaken by default, and that means looking at protected groups, making sure that we include the Fair Scotland duty, the children's rights, and now increasingly climate change sustainability, so that we're starting off from the point of view of having considered what the likely outcomes are and redesigned things at the outset. The thing that I would say we are not good at and have on our to-do list is cumulative impact assessment. And from a funding point of view, we've had successful community budgeting, but what we haven't done successfully yet is that human rights budgeting. So again, that's on our to-do list.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, we've just published our annual report on the Glasgow Community Plan, which is our local outcome improvement plan. And for me, that's the citywide approach. So that's what are the community planning partners actually achieving. But linked to that, I think it's very important not just to have that corporate approach. So, you know, sitting alongside that is the locality plans as well. And I suppose the feedback that comes from local level about what's worked well, what's worked not so well, what's challenging. And Equalities runs the whole way through that as well. So in a way, it was a kind of three-pronged approach to bring it all together into one place. I think going forward and looking at how we do our community action plan, it's got to be embedded within community empowerment services. I think Equalities is there, but Equalities also has to run the whole way through it. The Glasgow Equality Forum is represented when partners come together to do the next iteration of the Community Action Plan. Glasgow Equality Forum will be there as one of our partners, as will Glasgow Third Sector Interface Network. So for me, I suppose it's very easy to take a kind of corporate approach to these things, but for me, I'm much more interested in how can we strengthen the structures and the organisations that we have at local level to really help us deliver better outcomes, and how do we listen to what they're telling us and the feedback they're giving us so that we can then change and shape services to, in a sense, work better. We also have a new performance management framework that links to the community plan. It's very much work in progress. There's lots of data in it. It's very, very technical. We're going to be doing, I suppose, development sessions for our elected members around that framework, and I suppose for officers as well to understand how can we actually use it to best effect. But what we also want to include within that are the stories that we get from the communities and the feedback, as well as information from all the community planning partners, so that we can have a full picture, I suppose, of what it is we're actually trying to achieve. So we're trying to join these things up and make sure that the community plan and the community action plan are linked, and they're both linked to our performance management framework. But it's work in progress. I think it's going in the right direction.
Perfect. Did you get anything to add?
I don't have anything to add because I'm not involved at all in the LOIP sort of side of things, other than our strategic plan for the integration partnership is dovetailed with the LOIP, and we make sure that we're reporting on the similar themes. And again, equalities are key through that strategic plan, but that wasn't really your question, so I'll stop.
Thanks very much, Convener.
Angela.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Committee has heard evidence that third sector organisations are handing back contracts, in particular social care organisations. So I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of your own experience in your own areas and jurisdictions, and share your own reflections as to why that's the case.
Start with that one because I do know something about that. I suppose our challenge in Dumfries and Galloway is that we have an ageing population that is ageing more quickly than other parts of Scotland, and our young people are decreasing, and our working age population is also contracting. We are a net loser of population in terms of that demographic. So our biggest challenge around social care is actually the workforce. There's an element of, even if we had more money at times, we don't actually have the bodies. Part of that challenge is our rurality. We are finding it very difficult to fill packages that are in our more rural areas. That is a definite challenge. We're finding that we haven't had any home care agencies hand back packages. We have had some care homes recently that over the last couple of years have closed. Some of that's simply economy of scale. They are our smaller...
Sorry, forgive me for interrupting, but are those care homes third sector organisations?
Yes, so in Dumfries and Galloway, approximately 80% of our care at home is delivered by the third and independent sector, and 100% of our care homes are delivered by the independent and third sector. So
No, but when you say the independent
as
and
in
third sector, there is independent as in private,
yes.
commercial, but what I'm asking about is third sector.
So we have a combination of third sector organisations that class themselves as both third sector and independent sector, depending on which hat they've got on.
So third sector care homes have handed contracts back?
We don't have any third sector care homes. We only have independent sector care homes.
So
Sorry.
I appreciate the committee's inquiries with reference to the third
that's
sector.
Fine. Sorry, apologies.
you know, I think we'll all empathise with the situation you've outlined. So have you any experience in your area of third sector organisations handing back contracts?
We have had a few that have handed back and have changed contracts because they cannot get the workforce to be able to deliver those contracts. So what we have done is we work with our third sector partners who are delivering similar packages, and we're having package swaps essentially to try and zone things in a way that maybe makes it more commercially viable. Dumfries and Galloway Council is a living wage employer, so we require that all our care agencies pay the living wage, and we're also not a zero-hour contract either. So we're managing it within our contractual arrangements that we have just now. However, yeah, there are challenges, but it's workforce that is our biggest challenge, is actually being able to recruit the relevant people with the skills to be able to undertake the roles.
And that's the underlying issue in people handing back packages?
That's the underlying issue. It's
thank you.
Just the not.
Other members of the panel have experience of this? What about Glasgow?
I mean, I wouldn't be able to answer that question, but I could certainly find out for you, because I suppose what sits with me is a grant-giving fund. We do administer monies for other community planning partners through that fund, and in a way that prevents them having to enter into contracting commissioning processes. But I wouldn't be able to answer that question specifically for you, but I'll certainly find out.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Kendrick?
Likewise, if I tried to answer that, it'd be a slightly different question, so I won't waste your time.
That's fine. Professor?
The same. I'm aware that we have significant workforce challenges, but I'd be happy to come back with a more detailed response, because it's not my area of expertise.
That would be helpful, thank you.
Okay, I'll bring in Alec.
Thank you, Convener. This is particularly around something that sparked in my head after Linda Owen said about the fact you don't have charitable care homes or voluntary sector run care homes in your authority. And that's a phenomenon we see a lot more, because increasingly, and I declare an interest having worked in the care providing voluntary sector for the last 8 years before getting elected. But the reality is that in the commissioning environment, when contracts are put out to tender, oftentimes we will see the local authority bidding for its own contract, and we will also see independent sectors bidding for their own contract, bidding for the contract as well. That hides an economy of scale that the authority can put in terms of its central administration costs, and as a result, we see lots and lots of local charitable organisations missing out on that because of the lack of level playing field. Do you recognise that as a reality?
Clarify that whilst I said that I wasn't aware that we have that some organisations classify themselves as third sector or independent, or sometimes they classify themselves as both, depending. They could be members of Scottish Care, which would class them as an independent sector organisation, but their structure actually makes them a charitable group. So I don't specialise in care homes, so I would need to come back to you with the exact split. But we tend to class our care homes as independent sector under the banner of Scottish Care, because that's who we work with around that. But there are organisations that will have charitable status or social enterprise type models that operate some of our care services. So it was just a point of clarification. In terms of does the local authority bid for its own contracts? That's not our experience in Dumfries and Galloway, because of we don't tender for our own contracts. It tends to be separated out before you end up in that procurement situation, if there is going to be any in-house provision of a service.
Okay, thank you. The wording of my first question was perhaps a little clumsy. I guess what I'm driving at here is about the issue of full cost recovery for charitable organisations, voluntary sector organisations. Oftentimes you've got quite little, very local organisations that really aren't running with very much in terms of backroom function, but it is essential to their functioning nevertheless. And they're finding that they are unable to deliver services at the rate that is being commissioned at, and as a result they might lose out, and you might lose out on the expertise that they can provide in terms of the local knowledge, the focus as this inquiry is looking at in terms of Equalities perspective and expertise. What do you do to support those smaller organisations coming to the table?
Recently the council's been working with the Equalities groups, and we've actually ended up having instead of making it a formal tender, it was more of a collaborative approach, whereby there was all the groups that receive funding were brought together to try and find a way that they could support each other and still manage within the funding that's been allocated. I suppose we tend to fund the core costs. That's what our funding goes towards, because we appreciate that a lot of third sector organisations struggle to cover the core costs. I suppose to echo the previous, when I overheard the last session, we are not giving massive uplifts, if uplifts at all. So I suppose there is that real term whether we're still covering their core costs from what we had at the start of the contract, and that's always the challenge when you're funding someone for 3 to 5 years. We don't know. We can't predict what we think the inflationary rate is going to be next year, so therefore it's difficult to build that into a contract to be in line with inflation. However, things like living wage increases, we pass those on to the providers where living wage is a requirement of their contract. So yeah, in terms of the equalities groups, yeah, it is difficult because a lot of them are very small organisations, because they are not supporting huge numbers of people, but their work is very valuable, and I think we are trying to find different procurement routes rather than tendering for things where it's smaller organisations, because we appreciate that the resource required to tender for something can make quite a significant impact on the organisation. So we're trying to work within the Procurement Scotland regulations to find alternative options such as direct awarding for charities and groups such as like Women's Aid, for example, where there's quite obviously only 1 or 2 organisations locally providing that service. Yeah. It would be different if we were speaking about something like Care at Home, where there could be 20 different entries in the market.
Yes, I guess there were 2 or 3 things. The first is trying to make sure that people use all the available routes through the Procurement Act, and that we don't use competitive tendering where it's not appropriate, that what we're actually doing is trying to secure better outcomes for people through a longer term collaborative approach, and we should always try to do that where that's possible. In practical terms, certainly where we work with third sector around the more kind of health improvement agenda, we provide a link officer who will do quite a fair bit of that backroom function for things. We also work very closely with the third sector interface, so EVOC, Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council, provides a service for the whole of Lothian around things like information governance and data sharing, and helping smaller organisations to work with us to make sure that what would otherwise be onerous can be done to an appropriate standard in line with people's rights. Those are just 2 of the examples, but I think there's a bigger structural issue around how we think about funding and procurement mechanisms that enables full participation of the third sector and doesn't lead us down a route of having organisations that are more commercially focused rather than care and support focused.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Oliver Mundell and then Leafy.
Thank you, Convener. And just on the previous point that was raised, I mean, I'm certainly aware of Bankfoot Care Home in Moffat, which is community-owned, community-run and charitable, so I'd feel bad not to mention that, but they would be classified as independent sector, I think, for regulatory purposes. I was wondering, the Health and Social Care Alliance argues that tighter local authority budgets result in poorer experiences for service users and growing infringements of clients' human rights. Is that something you'd agree with?
If I could make a response there, I think one of the real pressures that the local authority and other potential funders have been under over the last 5-6 years has been the fact that a number of the smaller equalities organisations have found it really difficult to get onto a sustainable footing, mainly because of the difficulty of diversifying the funding base. One of the solutions that we came up with in Fife, where we were aware, following on from the 2010 Equality Act, of our requirement to cover all the protected characteristics and to ensure that there was a broad spread of services, was that we undertook a review of our funding for infrastructure support organisations across across all the protected characteristics, and we worked with our third sector interface, Fife Voluntary Action, to develop an independent equalities hub within the third sector, and that's what's emerged into the Fife Centre for Equalities. So rather than piecemeal funding across, at the time, around 4 of the 9 protected characteristics, we now have what we believe to be a much more robust and sustainable equalities group in Fife Centre for Equalities that then works with the smaller equalities groups, providing some of the infrastructure support that Alison referred to there in relation to the wider voluntary sector. And I think that that's one solution. It doesn't solve all the problems in terms of the smaller voluntary organisations working within the equalities field. But I do think we have to come up with new solutions, and we can't continue to erode funding to smaller voluntary organisations without thinking about new approaches and new operating models.
And have you had good uptake on that? And secondly, did you consult with those organisations before coming up with the new approach, or did the new approach come from you?
We certainly consulted with across all of the voluntary organisations that were working on in the equalities and diversities field, and there was a broad consensus that something needed to be done. But I would admit it wasn't painless, because clearly some of the existing voluntary organisations lost their funding. The hope, the intention was that they would then work with Fife Centre for Equalities to work in partnership, and in a number of cases that's happened.
But not in all cases?
Not in all cases, no.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
Just a couple of general points to say, if I may, that we fund Glasgow Council for the Voluntary Sector and other partners around capacity building, and we've just done a survey of what the needs will be of organisations going forward. With the introduction of the new Communities Fund, we're very mindful that we don't want to disadvantage smaller grassroots community groups and organisations who've been delivering, great services for many, many years. And in fact, in terms of the localism agenda, we've said that the funding model should be, 30-70 split between citywide and local areas. Now, that doesn't determine where the money is going to go, and that model will be adjusted depending on what applications come in. But it's recognising the localism agenda, and that actually we want to make sure that in communities and where money is needed, where services are needed, smaller organisations who've got a track record in delivering and have got good services to offer are not disadvantaged. So I suppose that's the kind of approach that we're taking, and again it fits back with the kind of community empowerment agenda, and I think a desire across the local authority and elected members to make sure that funding actually goes to where it's needed most and where it's actually going to make a difference. So it's balancing the support needs to help smaller organisations build their capacity and deliver, with actually having a look at what are we trying to achieve and where we feel that the funding needs to be targeted. In terms of our colleagues in the third sector and equalities groups, we're also looking at our funding panels, both through sector and area partnerships, but also citywide, and we recognise that this isn't actually what it's been for years, where bids have been assessed and actually it's renewed funding to very much the same tranche of organisations. In fact, it's been about 10% of the third sector who've had access to the old funding. So this is a new approach, and it's very different. It's learning, but we're giving thought to how we actually involve our colleagues in the equalities sector and the third sector on those funding panels. How do we bring in, you know, specific expertise, because we'll have to look at proposals that come in around certain themes. But very much to the fore of that is making sure that we're not disadvantaging smaller locally based organisations at the expense of more national ones who might have much more infrastructure and capacity, and we support our local organisations through that capacity building process.
Okay, thank you. Mary Fay.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. If we set aside the issue of funding, what else can the Scottish Government do to support third sector organisations? Stunned into silence.
It's difficult to answer on behalf of third sector organisations. I think that's why there was a little bit of a pause there. In terms of...
If I change it slightly and say, what could you do? If government fund your organisations to support third sector, what more could you do to support third sector apart from ensuring that there's funding available for them?
I think the point that both I and Bernadette have made in terms of the role of the third sector and third sector organisations within the wider community planning agenda is really important. And by that, I don't just mean a place for the third sector interface at the Community Planning Board table, which to an extent isn't, you know, really looking at that wider engagement. So some of the work that we've been doing is working with the wider third sector strategy group that works alongside the third sector interface to ensure that we support inclusion in the thematic partnership groups, such as our Communities and Wellbeing Partnership and our Welfare Reform and Anti-Poverty group. So I think support in terms of staff resources and also ensuring that the governance arrangements around both scrutiny and the delivery of outcomes has a place for equalities organisations in the wider third sector.
Just before I bring in other panel members, one of the comments that was made at the previous panel was that third sector organisations have a seat at the table, but they have no voting rights. So are voting rights something that your organisations could make a decision to say, you can come to the table, but you can also have voting rights? And if you can do that, why don't you do that?
Public bodies, no. Whatever the integration bill, the Public Bodies Joint Scotland Working Act, whatever, I can remember quite remember the right round. It doesn't allow for it. It requires that it stipulates who should be on your strategic planning group. It also stipulates who should be on your integration joint board. So we've ensured that we've got equalities groups on our strategic planning group, and they are the group that then informs our strategy, policy, strategic planning, etc. And we're making sure that through all our equality impact assessments, an invitation goes out to all our equalities groups to be involved. And to be honest, they don't all come, but they come to ones that are particularly of relevance to their interest area. I think in terms of your question about what else could be done, well, that a change in legislation, but I think also some of that capacity building through the third sector interfaces that, you know, I was a bit nervous coming here today thinking, my gosh, what are we going to get asked? How are we going to do this? And I'm supposed to be a professional that's sat at many committees and boards before. However, you know, if we're expecting people who are working in very local organisations who are endeavouring to do their best, they need that support and encouragement to be able to feel confident and comfortable at the table, because sometimes people may sit at the table, but if they can't feel empowered to contribute, then there's almost no point in them being there. So there's a wee bit about some of that development and support, which could come through the statutory or through the third sector organisations to enable that support.
Okay, that's helpful. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Quite practical things that could be achieved through some form of direction would be a requirement to undertake on statutory bodies to undertake capacity building. an expectation that we would have an umbrella of third sector organisations that we support, from the people who are and groups who are very challenging of the status quo and pushing us to do things differently, to those that we work with to deliver services. And in my experience, when I worked in both another country and another part of the UK, it worked really well if you had a system that allowed that umbrella to exist, with organisations that had different roles and responsibilities, so that they weren't trying to take on everything, and it was very clear that there was a degree of expertise, and that enabled change to happen quite rapidly. I think the other thing that we could make easier is career development across academic, third sector and statutory sector. It happens for individuals when there are particular tailored needs in different organisations, and it happens for individuals who have particular pushy natures. But actually, if it were built in, I think that would be that's something that would be really good. And if our accessibility and apprenticeship type schemes, if they built in that sort of pathway, I think that could be really helpful.
Okay. Bernadette, did you want to add something?
It was just to briefly say, I think probably the best thing we can do is actually listen to what they're telling us and take it on board. We had stakeholder engagement events around the creation of the new fund, and that was one thing. We've got our structures in place, we have our concordat, we're working on the third sector action plan, we're going to be looking at a strategy. But I suppose two practical examples of where we actually got an awful lot of value between working together with the third sector, but at the same time we expected a lot from them at short notice, and they delivered. And one was around the very first Glasgow Children's Holiday food programme, where it worked extremely well because we had a specific objective. The third sector mobilised, and they worked alongside us at short notice, and we could say the outcome of that initial programme was that more than 14,000 children across the city were fed as part of their holiday activities. There was an evaluation by impact funding, or previously VAF, but don't read the evaluation, read the last 2 pages with the case studies, and you see the impact, certainly in terms of family engagement or whatever, and it was just amazing. So we learned a lot from that about how we work together when we're trying to achieve a particular aim, and the value that the third sector really brings. In terms of our community budgeting pilots, the third sector networks and third sector organisations facilitated the work at local level to get the citizens panels up and running, to get people engaged, people who probably had never engaged in any of these processes before. And the evaluation has come back and told us some really positive things, but it's also telling us that actually we put a lot of pressure on our third sector partners to deliver for us at short notice. And if we're going to do that model in the future, I think we need to be mindful of how we properly resource the infrastructures and the support, the third sector networks that we actually have. So I suppose it's back to my earlier point about the kind of corporate approach is one thing, but I think there's also looking at what we've got in local areas that we can strengthen through resource, and whether it's support in kind, whether it's financial or whatever, to really help deliver the agenda and bring those two approaches together. So I think that's probably what I would offer in terms of your question.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you now about equality impact assessments and the robustness and value that's attached to them, particularly in relation to changes to social care budgets? Because one of the comments that has been made about equality impact assessments is that they are done without actually looking at the impact that a change in a social care budget will have on an individual. So how robust are the equality impact assessments that you do, and have you put in place any changes to make sure that you look at the full impact on any changes in social care?
Now, our template, every time I do one, it seems to have been tweaked and slightly changed to incorporate more things. So our template looks at the impact on equalities, human rights, climate and Fairer Scotland. So we look at all of those aspects anytime there's a new policy or strategy. Our Integration Joint Board will not accept papers that come forward that should have an impact assessment that don't. This has become a new thing because they were finding that sometimes they were getting impact assessments and sometimes they weren't. So they have now said any new policy, strategy or significant change requires to have an impact assessment. Personally, I find the process really helpful. We have a standard equality monitoring form that when we start any sort of new piece of work, we try to ensure that when we're engaging with people that we encourage them to complete the equalities impact monitoring form so that we can try and identify. As you'll appreciate, in Dumfries and Galloway, our equality groups are not a large percentage of our population. Therefore, it's quite difficult at times to find different or enough of a particular group to be able to sort of statistically significantly say there is a definite difference. So our equality impact monitoring forms help us when we're doing our engagement, which will then help us as we plan through. Because I think a bit like what Alison was saying, you know, we start with the impact assessment at the very beginning, so that by the time you're getting to the end of your piece of work and you're presenting it for approval or whatever, it's there shouldn't be too much changes. If you get to that point and you're having to significantly change your piece of work, then you haven't listened to the groups as you've gone along. So certainly we find that we have relatively good engagement from our local equalities groups who are very happy to be involved in those processes, very happy to be involved in engagement and consultation with us when it's relevant to the group of people that they represent or are involved in. But that's how I would put my opinion on it.
Okay. Does anyone else want to comment?
Just in terms of the wider use of equality impact assessments, rather than specifically focusing on social care, we're in the process, as you'll be aware, of pulling together the council's budget for the coming financial year. And one of the key challenges every year is to ensure that equality impact assessments aren't just tagged on as an afterthought, where officers have already essentially been through the process of looking at savings options and then feel that they'd better fill in an equality impact assessment. And that is a challenge in terms of ensuring that, as Linda said, it's part of the process, not just tagged on at the end, and that where officers are asked to explore potential mitigation measures, they actually do that and don't pluck them out of thin air. But I wouldn't pretend that it's not a huge challenge, and it's something that that directorates and services are constantly being challenged on in terms of the content.
I suppose the concern is that the individual gets lost in the process. I accept what you say, that lots of different people are pulled together to look at it, but the individual that a change in a package would have the biggest impact on is quite often lost in that whole process. And I'll give one very, very brief example of a very expensive 24-hour home care package for someone that lived in my area. And that package was cut in half. And at no point was that individual or the individual's family consulted, talked to, or explained to them why a cut in a social care budget in a local authority office would have that massive impact on the care and the deterioration in the health of the individual that the social care package was built around. And that's my fear, that individuals are lost within all of this.
Just to flag up, we have an equality impact assessment in Glasgow that's flexible and responsive to change, and there are reviews built in between 6 months to a year, and that's in order to pick up any unintended consequences that come from that. My colleague from our equalities team is here, and if you want any more information or for us to expand on that, we're very happy to do so afterwards or in writing for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, that brings our second panel to a close. Thank you very much for being here this morning and for your evidence. Our next meeting will take evidence on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. I now move into private session.